In this paper, and please follow along in the abstract on the back of the page, that way you can see what the arguments are and kind of look at the argument, refer back to the argument when I mention the premises as I go through the paper. So in this paper, I shall discuss one of St. Anselm's ontological arguments, review the famous Greatest Island critique of the argument, and analyze St. Thomas Aquinas' objections to the ontological argument. In doing so, I shall conclude that this version of the ontological argument, with some minor clarifications, is apparently valid and sound, though it ultimately needs support from arguments of St. Bonaventure and Leibniz. So 1. St. Anselm of Canterbury has at least 3 different versions of the ontological arguments in his work, the Proslogion. These are found in the 2nd, 3rd, along with the replies to his critic, Galileo. So although they are all ontological arguments, that is, arguments that demonstrate God's existence from the concept of being and a priori premises, they differ in focus. The argument in the 2nd chapter of the Proslogion, the argument in the 2nd chapter focuses on the greatness of God's being. The argument in the 3rd examines the necessity of God's being. And the one found in the replies looks to the characteristic of beings that can be imagined as non-existing. So in this paper, I shall be focusing on the argument from Proslogion's 2nd chapter, that is, the argument from God's greatness. So in chapter 2 of the Proslogion, St. Anselm lays out the argument as follows. When the fool hears something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears, and what he understands in his mind is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. For it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. And surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. For if it exists solely in the mind, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. So if you look at the argument on the abstract, it's laid out there. With an implied premise and minor modifications, the argument can be laid out clearly. The assumption for the reductio ad absurdum, that is the assumption made that's going to be rendered absurd, is that than which a greater cannot be thought does not exist in reality. Premise 1, that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind. Premise 2, all other qualities being the same, it is greater to exist in reality and mind than in mind alone. 3, something with all of that than which a greater cannot be thought's qualities can be thought to exist in reality. So 4, therefore, that than which a greater cannot be thought, a greater can be thought. But this is absurd, so since 4 is absurd, the assumption must be rejected. Therefore, that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in reality. So one point I want to make. One ought not to object that the term greater is somehow subjective and call premise 2 into question. Clearly something can have more or less existence. For instance, whatever finite object you're now looking at exists only where and when it does, and does not exist everywhere and whenever else simultaneously. Hence it is lacking in existence, and so is objectively less than being itself. For instance, this light exists here, it does not exist here, so it's lacking in some manner of existence. Greatness, then, refers to the objective degree of one's being, and don't think this is just a spatio-temporal thing, as a spatio-temporal thing is also a limit on being. But this is just an example how something can have more or less being. Thus, the term greatness unqualified, which the greatest would have, objectively refers to being, that is existence, without qualification, without limit. It does not refer to what is great in accord with our particular likes or dislikes. So such is Anselm's first ontological argument for God's existence, the one found in the 2nd chapter of the Proslogion, and his conclusion follows from apparently true premises. However, even from its inception, this argument has obviously had no shortage of criticisms, and I shall now analyze a few of them. So on to point number 2. Anselm's work was reviewed by his contemporaries, and the most famous criticism, the present argument, originated from one such contemporary, a monk by the name of Ganilo of Marmoutiers. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but although his criticism is not directly applicable to what Anselm wrote, it is at least implicit in what Ganilo explicitly states. So in summary, Ganilo's criticism, at least in spirit, might be called an overload argument. That is, Ganilo attempts to show that if Anselm's argument worked, one could prove just about anything existed by simply adding greatness to the definition of that thing. The specific example that Ganilo implicitly gives, again, he's only implicitly doing so, he doesn't quite lay out this argument right. The implicitly gives is to replace that than which none greater can be conceived, or that than which none greater can be thought, with that island than which a greater cannot be thought. However, one might replace island with any crazy thing like a flying pig or a unicorn. Since one can apparently prove just anything exists in the same way as Anselm proved God, it appears Ganilo might be onto something. Yet this is only an apparent refutation. Ganilo's counter-argument clearly fails despite being the most popular criticism of the argument. Anselm suggests that the logic of his own argument would apply only to God. But he doesn't exactly show us clearly why that is. So perhaps it is because of Ganilo's failure to lay out the overload argument explicitly. Nevertheless, St. Bonaventure shows us precisely why an overload argument would fail. According to St. Bonaventure, to talk about an island than which a greater cannot be thought is like talking about a four-sided triangle. It does not exist in the mind, like premise 1 of St. Anselm's argument requires. Bonaventure states that since an island is a limited being, there is a contradiction in the adjunct. That island in which a greater cannot be thought can be conceived only irrationally. Bonaventure is showing that a greater cannot be thought, that means the same thing as perfect or infinite. Since only the infinite is that which none greater can be thought. So logically, by claiming there is some island than which a greater cannot be thought, one is saying an infinite finite is conceivable. But, being a contradiction in terms, like a four-sided triangle, this cannot be so. For instance, an island has boundaries of its existence where it meets the water, and so a greater can always be thought of for any possible island, just like a number, by extending it to something slightly more substantial than the last conception. Since only God is truly infinite, it follows the argument can only work with God, and no other object can be defined into existence, and I kind of put that in chuckle quotes, defined into existence, using Anselm's logic. So number 3, St. Thomas Aquinas has at least 2 objections to St. Anselm's argument. Aquinas states, perhaps not everyone who hears this word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought. But whether one calls this God or not is irrelevant to the proof. Needless to say, most would call this thing God, and if this be one's objection to Anselm, it could easily be shown that even if one does not want to call this God, it is at least what monotheism philosophically means when the verbal utterance, God, is used. If a critic enjoys using some other verbal utterance for the same meaning, it is not relevant to the truth of the argument itself. At any rate, even though most men call that God, the criticism does not show the argument fails to prove that than which a greater cannot be thought exists. It only shows people can have peculiar choices of words for certain meanings. Aquinas goes on, however. Granted that everyone understands that by this word, God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought, nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists, unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. The criticism, as you might be able to tell, is somewhat unclear. Perhaps Aquinas is saying one cannot get from the idea of something to its existence. That's one possible interpretation. However, such a criticism does not show how Anselm's argument is wrong for doing precisely that. If Aquinas means this, and is arguing against the conclusion, if he means this, that something cannot be demonstrated to exist by thought, even if logic dictates it, then Aquinas would be saying logic does not apply to reality, which is absurd and leads to Kantian dualism. This is not likely what Aquinas meant, as he also states, we do not know the essence of God. The proposition is not self-evident to us. In fact, the very criticism comes from that section in the Summa about God's self-evident existence. In other words, it appears his actual criticism is that one cannot understand that than which a greater cannot be thought implies existence, since one does not even know the term. It is a concept none have save for a set of mental words. Perhaps, then, Aquinas is denying premise 1 or 3 of the argument, that the concept of God exists in the mind. Men do not fully understand God, but is it not understood that he must be that in which a greater cannot be thought? From that, is it not clear that he exists, even if he only is seen like through a glass darkly? As Anselm says, if you say, because it is not completely understood, it cannot be understood at all, and cannot be in the mind, then you must say that one who cannot see the purest light of the sun directly does not see daylight. Even if it were an effective criticism, even if Aquinas' point that we don't know God was an effective criticism, one could simply replace in mind, in premise 1, with in concept, or perhaps in a possibility. So God existing as a possible thing, or possibly God exists, could be replaced with that concept of in mind, and you remove that problem of a particular individual's understanding. Yet perhaps there is something deeper to Aquinas' criticism even than this. If one does not fully know God, how is it clear that God is not a contradictory concept, like the greatest possible island is? In other words, how does one really know premise 1 and 3 can be possible, can be a concept? Can God's logical coherency then be proved? Leibniz holds the answer. He saw this problem himself and noted that if God were possible, if premise 1 and 3 were true, then the ontological argument clearly follows. But God's possibility is not initially obvious. Leibniz, however, states that nothing can prevent the possibility of what is without limits, without negation, and consequently without contradiction. A thing is only impossible, that is fully inconceivable, if the thing is contradictory, such as a square circle or a four-sided triangle, which you cannot even begin to imagine. An internal contradiction only arises due to a conflicting limit or negation of that thing. For example, limitedness to four-sidedness or three-sidedness. Without limits, there is no possible internal contradiction, for a contradiction necessarily involves negation. If something is infinite, that is unnegated, then a contradiction cannot arise in it. Furthermore, there is nothing that can cause it to be contradicted externally either, for otherwise there could absurdly be a negation of the unnegated. Consequently, since that than which a greater cannot be thought means the infinite, God is thus necessarily possible and not fully inconceivable. Hence, St. Thomas Aquinas' objections fail, and St. Anselm's argument is apparently sound.